After the invaders' ships vanished beyond the horizon and the last embers of the fires faded, leaving the bodies of fallen warriors to embrace the earth, a new, even more brutal nightmare began for the surviving women. It is a common misconception that Viking raids ended with the departure of their long ships. However, what awaited widows in the first hours after their husbands' tragic deaths was far from mercy or mourning. It was a cold, calculated cruelty, beside which the initial attack might have seemed an act of compassion. Here, we will delve into the documented events of that era, uncovering forgotten histories, ignored laws, and customs that transformed grief into unspeakable horror. This text is based on meticulous research and irrefutable facts, supported by sources from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and archaeological discoveries made during excavations in Repton. On June 8, 793, at Lindisfarne, flames engulfed the monastery, its monks either killed or captured. 15 miles south, in Bamborough, Lady Ilfled watched in horror as smoke rose above the Holy Island. Her husband, Eadwulf, had led the garrison to repel the attack but never returned, leaving Elfled a widow. By midday, she had become a rightless possession. The laws of Northumbria were mercilessly clear. A widow was entitled to a mourning gift and 1/3 of movable property, but only if she maintained chastity for a year, had no male relatives claiming authority, and was not deemed overly dangerous to independence by the local thing. Elfled, a landowner, controller of trade routes, and holder of the loyalty of 40 households, posed a significant threat to ambitious men. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle chillingly recorded the subsequent events. The widow was given to born red against her will. No ceremony, no consent, simply a political transaction veiled in legal language. Her mourning gift was absorbed into born red's holdings, her servants became his property, and her children from her first marriage were rendered bastards, stripped of their inheritance rights. This tragedy was not unique to Northumbria. It was a sinister pattern, repeated in every kingdom ravaged by the Vikings. The raiders not only killed warriors, but also destabilized power structures. Widows became the fault lines along which ambitious men redrew the political landscape. Dublin, 841. Thorgest's fleet ravaged the Irish coast. In Armagh, Chief Macertho fell defending the monastery. His wife, Gormflaith, controlled mountain passes and 300 head of cattle. Within days, her brother-in-law, Donshad, declared guardianship over her and her wealth. The annals of Ulster succinctly recorded her fate. Gormflaith was married off to secure the cattle roads. However, the situation grew even grimmer. Irish Brecon laws required a widow's consent for remarriage, prescribed a year of mourning, and protected her property rights. Donshad cynically ignored every law. Why? Because under the constant Viking threat, legal formalities became an unaffordable luxury. Gormflaith's mountain passes were valued above her dignity. Archaeological evidence from Lagore. Crannog corroborates the written accounts. Excavations revealed a female burial, dated precisely to this period. Gold torques adorned her neck, silver bracelets her wrists, yet her skull bore signs of blunt force trauma. Her ribs were broken. The woman had been bludgeoned to death, dressed in her finest jewelry. This was not a robbery, but a ritualistic subjugation. This horrifying pattern spread across the North Sea like a plague. In the Frankish kingdoms, Charlemagne's capitularies established protection for widows. However, after 845, with the intensification of Viking raids, local counts began to disregard imperial law. The Annals of St. Bertin documented numerous cases of forced remarriages, property seizures, and the sale of children into slavery to pay debts their mothers never incurred. Take, for example, Gisela, widow of Count Bernard of the Spanish March. After her husband's death in battle against Danish raiders in 844, she inherited 6 estates and commanded 200 armed vassals. Charles the Bald confirmed her holdings with a written charter. However, Count Wilfrid of Barcelona had other plans. He claimed Bernard owed him silver for mercenaries and seized Gisella's lands as payment. When she protested to the king, Wilfrid presented witnesses who swore she practiced witchcraft. The accusations were absurd, but effective. Carolingian law prescribed death for witchcraft. Gisela had two choices: marry Wilfrid or burn at the stake. She chose marriage. Her vassals became his men. Her silver financed his next campaign, and her children vanished without a trace from historical records. This was not about love or lust, but logistics. Viking raids didn't just destroy armies, they shattered economic networks that had taken generations to build. Trade routes withered, tax collection collapsed, and military service disintegrated. In this chaos, widows became the fastest way to restore order, control the woman, and you controlled her resources and the loyalty of her people. The speed of these transactions was astonishing. In York, after the city was captured by Danish forces in 866, King Ella fell in battle, and Queen Osburh was expected to inherit the regency for their young son. However, the Northumbrian Witenagemot, within hours, declared her unfit for the role and appointed her late husband's brother as regent. Osburh was married off to a minor thane in Wessex before her husband's body had even grown cold. A husband's death ushered in dark times for women whose bodies barely had time to mourn before becoming objects of others' claims. Particularly tragic were the fates of those who tried to resist imposed wills. The life of Saint Batild tells us the story of Lady Harriswith of Moe, whose husband fell in battle against Vikings at the walls of Nottingham in 868. Rejecting all proposals for a new marriage, she sought protection within the walls of Whitby Abbey, but the local Earl Wulfhere demanded King Ethelred expel her, citing military necessity for land defense. After 3 months of defiance, Wulfhere's men forcibly dragged her from the abbey at dawn, stripped her of her monastic robes, and dressed her in a wedding gown. The marriage ceremony took place immediately, and by sunset she was the wife of a man she had never seen before. The abbess who granted her refuge was fined 50 silver coins for harboring fugitive property. Existing legal norms made resistance virtually impossible. Northumbrian law recognized a widow's right to remain unmarried, but simultaneously granted male relatives the right to override this choice if the interests of defense demanded it. Constant Viking raids always served as justification for such intervention. Visigothic law in Spain followed a similar practice, and Frankish capitularies contained loopholes for times of war and emergency. The fate of children was particularly alarming. According to Anglo-Saxon laws, a widow's children from previous marriages lost their inheritance rights if she remarried. Her new husband gained full control over their property until they reached adulthood, and in the event of their death before that time, became its full owner. The mortality rate among stepchildren during this period sharply increased. Archaeological findings in Winchester cemeteries revealed patterns indicating the burial of children aged 7 to 14 with signs of malnutrition and abuse. These data, based on medieval law codes and archaeological studies of burials, attest to the tragic fate of children in an era of violent change. Economic calculations were ruthless. Kenneth's charter of 871 valued a widow at 30 silver coins if she was capable of childbearing, 20 if she could no longer bear children, and 15 if she had no land. In comparison, the price of a trained warrior was 12 silver coins, a good sword 8, and a year's supply of grain 6. Widows in this system were not people but assets, redistributed for maximum strategic benefit. The compressed timelines for decision-making exacerbated the situation. In peacetime, courtship and negotiations could last for months, but after Viking raids, decisions were made in a matter of hours. Local rulers could not wait for royal approval or ecclesiastical blessing. They seized what they could while chaos reigned. Legal disputes arose later, if at all. Psychological warfare was an integral part of the conqueror's strategy. Vikings, when attacking, primarily eliminated male leaders, killing earls, jarls, and thanes publicly to sow maximum terror. But women were left alive. Why? Forcing widows into humiliating marriages was a way to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Your men are dead, your laws are worthless, your dignity means nothing. This pattern recurred in many cultures. When the great heathen army ravaged East Anglia in 869, King Edmund was killed, tied to a tree and pierced with arrows. His widow, Elfthrith, was to rule as regent for their young son, but the surviving nobles gave her to the Danish chieftain Ubba as a condition of peace. She became his concubine, and her son disappeared from history. The royal line was broken with her humiliation. The most systematic abuses occurred in Ireland. The Norse, establishing permanent bases in Dublin and Cork, didn't just raid and leave, they stayed, intermarried with local dynasties, and created hybrid power structures that institutionalized the problem of widows. In the Irish maritime kingdoms, a special term even emerged for these forced marriages: hostage brides. Women whose husbands died fighting Vikings were married off to Norse jarls to secure peace treaties. Their children became living links between former enemies, but the women themselves became captives in their own homes, speaking foreign languages, worshipping foreign gods, and bearing children for the men who had killed their first husbands. Aud the Deep-Minded was a rare exception that proved the rule. After her husband, Olaf the White, died in battle in Ireland, she refused remarriage, converted to Christianity, and led a migration to Iceland with 20 ships and 900 followers. Her success was due to the personal loyalty of the warriors who had followed her husband. Most widows had no such protection. Icelandic sagas preserve the stories of less fortunate women. Hallgerda Longlegs was forced into marriage 3 times after the death of each husband. Each time, it was arranged for political purposes, completely unrelated to her desires. When she finally rebelled, refusing to help her third husband in a crisis, the saga portrayed her as a villain. Archaeological data from Iceland tells a different story. Female burials from this period contain evidence of unusual injuries, poorly healed bone fractures, dental wear indicating malnutrition, stress markers, and bone structure consistent with chronic anxiety. These women lived under constant threat. During the Middle Ages, as Viking raids became a harsh reality, a constant threat emerged for widows. On the continent, the legal system underwent changes aimed at making the abuse of widows even more sophisticated. The Laws of Wessex, created by Alfred the Great, contained specific provisions concerning war widows, whose property rights were temporarily suspended during times of extreme danger. Local reeves were granted the right to arrange marriages without royal approval if military necessity demanded it, and a widow's consent was considered desirable but not obligatory. The church seemed unable to offer reliable protection. Bishops who dared to protest forced marriages found their monasteries vulnerable to sudden Viking raids. Parish priests who refused to conduct unwanted ceremonies were stripped of their posts. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued official dispensations for marriages violating canon law, justifying them by the pressing needs of Christian defense. Even nunneries, which should have been sanctuaries, became hunting grounds. The monastery at Barking, one of England's most influential religious houses, was plundered not by Vikings, but by Saxon nobles seeking wealthy widows who had taken refuge there. Abbess Ethelberg protested to King Alfred, but his response, recorded in a surviving charter, stated, "The needs of the kingdom outweigh the comfort of individuals." The scale of this systematic abuse became evident when contrasted with Viking raiding patterns. Every major invasion was accompanied by a surge in forced marriages within a 50-mile radius of the attack zone. Such a pattern could not have been coincidental. Local magnates exploited Viking terror as a cover for land grabs that would have been illegal in peacetime. The psychological damage from these actions extended for generations. Children born of forced unions grew up torn between two identities. They were raised by mothers mourning their true fathers and were compelled to serve men who had destroyed their families. Stress and grief shattered entire kinship networks, undermined trust, and eroded social cohesion. Yet even in these unbearable circumstances, there were those who resisted. The Chronicle of Iona recounts the story of Lady Deirdre of the Hebrides, whose husband died defending against Norse raiders in 875. The local chieftain claimed her as tribute, and she agreed to the marriage, but on her wedding night poisoned him with mushrooms she had gathered herself. She was caught and burned alive, but her act of defiance inspired other women in the islands. The annals of Wales preserved similar stories of women who chose death over dishonor, and mothers who killed their own children to prevent them from being used in political marriages. Records called them saints and martyrs, but in reality, they were victims of a system that stripped them of their dignity and made death the only escape. The economic logic ultimately collapsed. By the end of the 9th century, due to numerous forced marriages, property rights were so destabilized that trade declined. Merchants could not trust contracts when ownership changed daily due to political marriages. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms faced an economic crisis that weakened their military capabilities precisely when they were most needed. Alfred the Great finally recognized the problem. His later law codes restored protections for widows and prescribed cooling-off periods after battles, but the damage had already been done. An entire generation of women learned that legal rights meant nothing when men wanted their property. This pattern disappeared only when Viking raids became less frequent and political structures stabilized, but the trauma lingered. Medieval chronicles rarely mention women's voices directly, but when they do, the pain pierces through the centuries. Lady Godiva's will, written in 1043, contains the line, "Let no woman trust the law when swords are drawn." The mass grave at Repton tells the final story. Recent excavations revealed 264 bodies from the Danish winter camp of 873-874, but beneath the warrior burials are smaller graves belonging to women and children. Dental analysis showed these were local Anglo-Saxons, not Danes. Carbon dating confirmed they died during the winter occupation. These were not battle casualties, but forgotten victims of the systematic cruelty that accompanied every Viking raid. These were women whose husbands died defending their homes, and children whose mothers were forced into marriages that disinherited them. Warriors found glory in death, while the victims found anonymous graves in a foreign land. Continental evidence revealed even darker patterns. In the Frankish territories, Charles the Bald's Capitulary of 864 specifically addressed the redistribution of widows after Viking attacks. The language was clinical: property assessment, strategic value, reproductive potential. Women were classified as livestock and sorted by age and fertility for maximum political gain. Political expediency often determined the fates of widows during the Viking Age, as their marriages became tools for consolidating power and territorial stability. At Santen Monastery, evidence of a methodical approach to this issue has been preserved. After devastating Danish raids on the Seine Valley in 857, royal envoys arrived to compile lists of widowed women, their land holdings, cattle, and trade connections. Then, based on meticulously crafted tables, marriages were arranged to balance regional influence. Thus, Lady Rot of Pontoise, owner of grain mills worth 200 silver coins, was married to Count Odo, who controlled important river crossings. The woman's feelings were not taken into account. Contemporaries were struck by the swiftness of such deals. The monk Nithard wrote in 858, "Scarcely had the smoke cleared over the burned halls when marriage contracts were already sealed." The bureaucratic efficiency was impressive. Regional administrators carried pre-prepared marriage documents into which only names needed to be inserted. Marriage ceremonies were conducted immediately, often amidst the ruins of the women's former homes. However, resistance existed, though rarely recorded by chroniclers. The lives of saints preserved stories of women who chose martyrdom instead of forced marriage. Saint Rasha of the Ardennes, who refused to marry her husband's killer in 862, was burned alive for her defiance. Her cult secretly spread among women who understood the true meaning of her sacrifice. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms perfected these methods. The Burgel Hidaj, Alfred's Guide to Military Reorganization, contained detailed instructions for managing widows. Each burg maintained up-to-date lists of marriageable women, noting their property value and strategic significance. In the event of a Viking attack, local reeves could quickly arrange politically advantageous marriages. Documents reveal the heartless mathematics underlying these decisions. A widow in Kent with 50 acres of land had a different value than a widow in Wessex with 20 acres but more favorable river access. Age also played a role. Women under 30 were valued twice as highly as older women, regardless of land holdings. Fertility was paramount. A childless woman with extensive estates was worth less than a young peasant capable of bearing future warriors. In Ireland, the situation was complicated by the emergence of permanent Viking settlements. In the resulting hybrid culture, women were treated as diplomatic currency between communities. When Ivar the Boneless captured Dublin in 857, he married several Irish noblewomen to solidify alliances. However, these were not merely political marriages, but a systematic taking of hostages disguised as diplomacy. Irish annals preserve brutal details. Following the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, victorious Irish forces seized Viking women and compelled them into marriages with Irish chieftains. These were marriages of revenge, where women became living symbols of conquest, hostages caught between cultures. Archaeological discoveries in York reveal the physical repercussions of this system. Female skeletons from the late 9th century show signs of malnutrition, stress, and depression. Bone density was reduced, and dental health deteriorated. These women lived in constant fear, their bodies bearing the memory of decades-long psychological trauma. Legal mechanisms grew increasingly sophisticated. The Legis Henrici Primi, compiled around 1100, codified practices that had originated during the Viking Age. Widows could be declared militarily necessary for regional defense, rendering their consent legally irrelevant. The document cited precedents dating back to Alfred's time, establishing an institutional memory of these abuses. Economic incentives permeated all levels of society. Parish priests received silver for performing forced ceremonies, and local sheriffs were granted land for facilitating strategic marriages. Even abbesses profited by selectively granting or denying sanctuary to fleeing widows. The entire system created a financial interest in maintaining the abuse of widows' status as a political strategy. The psychological pressure extended beyond individual women. When Lady Ethelfled of Mercia demonstrated that widows could rule successfully in the early 1000s, neighboring kingdoms tightened restrictions on their own widows. Female independence became viewed as a military threat to be suppressed through enforced dependency. Documents from Normandy attest to the spread of these practices beyond direct Viking influence. Followers of Rollo, who settled in the region around 911, imported Scandinavian notions of women as property, blending them with Frankish legal traditions to create hybrid control systems even more restrictive than their origins. Throughout the history of conquests and power shifts, the fates of widows often served as tools in the hands of conquerors, rather than merely being a tragic consequence of war. The Normans, renowned for their military strategy, used the redistribution of widows to consolidate their power. Following their invasion of England in 1066, they not only seized lands but also compelled Saxon widows to marry Norman knights. This act created a semblance of legitimacy and continuity of rule. The Domesday Book contains hundreds of records of such marriages. each representing an attempt at cultural assimilation disguised as romantic relationships. Children born from these unions faced a complex predicament, torn between Norman upbringing and the memory of their mother's Saxon heritage, inheriting lands taken from their fathers. The psychological repercussions of these actions echoed through multiple generations, fostering identity crises and shattering familial bonds. Monastic chronicles preserve rare testimonies from women of that era. The Life of St. Margaret of Scotland, written around 1100, includes a quote from an unnamed Anglo-Saxon widow who lamented the loss of her name, lands, and her children's rights, noting that only the right to breathe was left to her, which she called a mercy. The cruelty of the system lay in its self-perpetuation. Daughters born into these forced marriages grew up expecting a similar fate, raised to believe that their bodies and property served only the political interests of men. Violence became normalized as victims began to raise their daughters to accept this state of affairs. However, archaeological findings also attest to acts of resistance. At Whithorn Abbey Cemetery, late 9th century burials were discovered where women were interred with weapons, not ceremonial, but battle-ready, showing signs of use. These women chose to fight rather than submit to forced marriage, opting for death but preserving their freedom. The economic decline of the widowhood system began in the 11th century as the political climate stabilized. By then, however, 3 generations of women had lived under the oppression of institutionalized violence, leading to irreversible social damage. Trust between men and women, parents and children, and rulers and subjects was eroded. The irony is that in the Viking homelands, the sagas celebrating their martial exploits remained silent about the fates of the women left behind. Archaeological evidence from Sweden and Denmark indicates similar patterns. When men perished in raids, their widows faced pressure from ambitious neighbors. The Vikings exported their brutality, but also applied it at home. History remembers long ships and battles, but forgets the women who paid a heavy price for Viking terror, losing their dignity, identity, and hope. Recent excavations in Winchester, beneath the cathedral's foundation, unearthed a mass burial of 43 women and a child, dated between 878 and 885 AD. Dental analysis revealed they had been brought from across Wessex. The body's orientation facing east towards the altar, the presence of expensive jewelry, and signs of violent death all suggest ritual sacrifice. A final piece of evidence is a silver bracelet from this burial, now held at the British Museum, bearing a Latin inscription, "Death before dishonor."